Here, I just want to take a look at our settings for the camera for motion, stereo and depth of field. These are simple camera effects that allow us to capture some of the elements of a real camera photographing things, namely in terms of motion blur and depth of field, but then we will also have stereo, which is for stereoscopic rendering for 3D based. So let's see first motion blur. We can preview this here in VPR. We turn it on and we see that our motion is blurred because this ball, as we can notice, is moving across the screen there. Then with motion blur on, the motion picks up this little blur. Blur length is simply how great that blur is. You can increase it beyond 100%, though 100% of course is the full frame time. So for instance here, where we've got 24 frames per second, then a blur length of 100% basically means the same as getting a 1/24th of a second exposure. As you can see, there are other ways in which to represent blur length, and you see them down here. Shutter angle 360 degrees, or exposure time of 0.417 seconds, or a 24th of a second. 50% is most common because the most common shutter angle that's used on movie cameras is a 180 degree shutter, but that said, you don't have to stick with that. Shutter open, this is what we would think of as the synchronization of the shutter. If we see, for instance, as we come to frame 15, right, the ball is arriving at that point just there, and when we have the motion blur turned on with the shutter open at 0, then we see that the edge of the blur is at that same position as where the edge of the ball is, right? Essentially, the shutter is opening at the very start of the frame and then capturing movement as the ball moves across. As we send shutter open to 100%, then we get this effect here, where the ball seems to be further over to that side. This is more like rear curtain sync. So you'll notice if I turn motion blur off and jump across to frame 16, you see it's picking up where the ball arrives. Here's the edge of the ball as it is at frame 16, and there you can see the blur is just coming over that edge there as we arrive. So it's basically which side of the frame the blur is occurring on is controlled by the shutter open. Shutter efficiency is for how efficient the shutter is at letting in light, so when that is turned down, then the motion blur areas darken for us. As the shutter is less efficient, it allows in less light, again similar to a physical camera. And we also have this option here for rolling shutter, which if we turn that on, we see blurs our object on a slant here. The rolling shutter effect is an effect that's created in a camera by having a shutter that moves across the frame that's being photographed whilst things are in motion. As such, you take a car here that's moving forward. If the shutter is moving down, then the top of the car gets exposed first, but by the time the shutter gets down to exposing the bottom of the car, it's moved forward some. This is a feature that you see on some movie cameras, and you also see it on modern cameras that use a CMOS sensor. Fast-moving objects don't just blur, they also distort. Trying to match that if you're doing visual effects can be a problem, because of course if you have no rolling shutter in your CG elements, but you do in your live action elements, then the two really don't match up very well on screen. The rolling shutter effect basically just allows you to render elements with a rolling shutter effect, and you can dictate which way it goes. So at negative, the shutter is moving from bottom to top, and at positive, the shutter is moving from top to bottom. So those are the effects for motion blur. Very simple. Of course, you also have particle blur here, which if you have particles in your scene, then you would turn that on in order to have those blurred. The reason that is separate is because, of course, with fast-moving particles, it isn't always needed but also it can be more expensive in terms of render time. Depth of field is a lens effect where we see blurring in our image at different levels of focusing, or rather, the level at which our lens is focused is where everything is sharp and in focus, and things that are either further in front or behind that point of focus begin to blur out. Focal distance is always at a distance from our camera, so you can see here that as we change the focal distance, we have this ring around our camera that goes up and down to show us where our point of focus is. Of course, when rendered with depth of field on like this, then we see items that are at the point of focus render up nice and sharp, whilst things further off behind there start to blur out. Or of course the other way round, if we push the focal distance further away, then we're getting things back here start to be rendered in nice sharp detail, whilst things that are closer to us have become blurry. The f-stop value defines the amount of blurring. As we go to higher values, then the blurring becomes less, and as we go to lower values, the blurring becomes greater. Might sound strange that large numbers mean less blurring and low numbers mean more blurring, but that is how it is in a real camera. We have this setting here, diaphragm sides. The cause of depth of field blur is the diaphragm. It is the aperture inside the camera lens, and it is the size of that aperture that controls the amount of blurring. Of course, most of us will be familiar with what an aperture looks like. It's made up of these interlocking blades that overlap one another, and by sliding those you can make the aperture become bigger or smaller. Because of this, the aperture takes on a shape, takes on the shape of a polygon. That's what the side setting lets you do. At 0, then it's just a perfect circle. 1 and 2 of course mean nothing, but if we go to 3, then we'll see that the focal blur starts to take on the characteristic shape of the aperture. So we can see the highlights that are going out of focus on our blob back there are becoming triangular. Very common setting can be 6, as this gives you this little hexagonal shape to the depth of field blur, which is common to a lot of cameras. The rotation simply just rotates the angle of this shape and which way round it is oriented. Lastly then, we have stereoscopic rendering, which allows you to make double renders for stereo 3D projection. When this is enabled, you can see a representation of it here in the viewport as different cameras. You have, of course, the actual camera itself, which at the minute is in the centre, and then you have the left and right cameras. Of course, you can't select these, they are all the same camera, but they represent the angles from which the left and right eye versions will be rendered. You have a couple of simple adjustments here. So, of course, eye separation lets you set how far apart the two eyes are. Normally it's best to stick with that at the default of 70mm or thereabout, which is about average for human eye separation. You can envelope it so that it can be animated and you can make the eyes move apart like this. If you do that, however, you are likely to make people quite sick. Next we have convergence. This will, instead of having the left and right cameras just be parallel to one another, this will tilt them so that they converge on a single point. This is, of course, the point at which the viewer perceives essentially no depth. Anything in front of this point appears to come out of the screen towards the viewer, and anything behind this point appears to be sunk into the screen away from the viewer. This is quite common, and of course you see it in a lot of 3D content where you have things that appear to come out of the screen. However, some people aren't entirely certain that it's the best way to do things, and if you use parallel cameras, then everything more or less appears to be retreating into the screen. The thing that you get when using convergence, this will be a bit easier to see if I offset the cameras from one another here, is of course that because the cameras are no longer parallel, then the planes that they are viewing at, that which would essentially be the screen from the viewer's perspective, is not parallel. You're effectively looking at two slightly tilted screens, one with each eye. Having it like this can be more natural for the eye if using a convergence point. However, it gives you an effect that's called keystone, where the two images don't quite line up properly. This can be fixed by using the toe-in here, which either brings both into parallel or leaves them at those angles like that. And of course you can set anywhere in between. Which is the best way round to do this? Do you use convergence or not? Do you have toe-in or not? This is an unsettled question. You do have different opinions on it. Have a look online if you like. Here's a little article on vfxio.com that explains the different outcomes and the different reasons why you may or may not wish to use certain settings. Lastly, you have this setting here, stereo tracked eye. At the minute it's set to center, but you can set that to be either left or right eye, like this. You notice that when I change that, the position or the pivot point of the camera is switching to the appropriate eye here. Basically, this lets you compose through one camera or the other. So here you see I'm on left eye, I'm actually looking through the left camera. Here on right eye, I'm looking through the right camera, and of course at center eye, then I'm looking somewhere between the two cameras. Again, this is a point of debate. What is the best way to compose? Do you compose your photography from a central camera that is between the two, and then of course live with the fact that neither of the two renders you get will be exactly that composition? They'll be to one side and the other of it. Or do you compose for one particular eye and then of course have the other eye be even more out of place? Again, there's no fixed answer. Once you have all of that though, you've also got here Stereo OpenGL. This allows you to preview the stereo effect in OpenGL, either using anaglyph, which is the good old red and blue glasses that we're all familiar with from the 1950s. It just allows you to view your 3D scene like that. Alternatively, if you have a 3D monitor with the special polarized glasses, then you can use the 3D glasses method, which of course requires your graphics card and monitor to use actual stereo 3D. And whilst we're on the subject of that OpenGL preview, do note that it's not just the stereo that you can preview in OpenGL. All of these camera effects can be previewed in OpenGL, as well as, of course, VPR. You simply turn on the DOF Blur preview here, and you will get a preview of the depth of field or motion blur effects just in plain OpenGL. So there we go. Those are the camera feature options and how we can use them in our renders and compositions.